2 weeks ago, my mother handed me an invoice for $312,442.18. We were sitting at the mahogany table for our usual Sunday dinner. The room smelled like roast chicken and rosemary, a scent that used to mean safety but now felt like a trap. My father was busy carving the meat, his eyes fixed on the plate as if nothing in the world was unusual. The silver clinked against the china in a steady, rhythmic beat. Then the air shifted. My mother didn't pass the gravy or ask about my week. Instead, she slid a thick white envelope across the tablecloth. It moved slowly, catching on a stray breadcrumb before stopping right in front of my plate. She looked at me with a gaze that was terrifyingly calm, and said, "Since you think you're so independent now, I thought it was time you reimbursed us." I opened it with shaking fingers. The subject line at the top of the typed page read, "Cost of raising an ungrateful daughter." No one laughed. My younger brother, who always got away with everything, just smirked from across the table. I felt the blood drain from my face as the numbers stared back at me. My name is Rayell McCante, and for 5 full seconds I waited for someone to tell me this was a cruel joke. I looked at my father, hoping for a wink or a smile, but he remained silent. I looked back at the paper in my hands. It wasn't a joke. It was a professional, cold, and calculated document. There were specific line items that made my stomach churn. Under the medical section, I saw braces, $6,400. Under extracurriculars, it listed soccer registration, $3,020. Then, my eyes hit a line that made my heart stop. Emotional stress, $18,000. She had even billed me for college application fees and 18 years of groceries, itemized by the year. At the very bottom of the page, she had added interest calculated at 3% annually, labeled as for delayed appreciation. The final total was highlighted in a bright neon yellow marker that seemed to burn my retinas. "You make good money now at your firm," my mother said, sipping her water as if she were discussing the weather. "It's only fair that you pay us back for the investment we made in you." My father still avoided eye contact, focusing intently on his peas. That dinner should have been the end of the humiliation, but it was just the beginning. As I sat there, the memories of the pattern I grew up with started to flood my mind. It had always been this way, though I had tried to ignore it for years. Growing up, the rules were never the same for me as they were for my brother. When he wanted a car for his 16th birthday, my parents didn't hesitate. They co-signed for a brand new truck immediately. But when I needed help buying my textbooks for university, I was told to figure it out, because I needed to learn the value of $1. When he missed his curfew by 3 hours, my mother would just sigh and say, "Boys will be boys." If I was even 10 minutes late, my phone was confiscated for an entire month. I learned very early in life that my parents' approval was conditional, based entirely on how much I could do for them or how little I cost them. I truly thought that becoming an adult and starting my own career would reset the scoreboard. I thought we could finally just be a family. Apparently, my balance was still due, and my mother intended to collect every cent. When I turned 22, I moved out and started paying my own way through grad school, taking on massive loans to keep myself afloat. I thought I was free. But over the last 3 years, the phone calls from my mother were never about how I was doing. They were always about emergencies. One month, the dishwasher broke, and they couldn't afford the repair. The next month, Dad's back treatments weren't fully covered by insurance and they were short on cash. Then it was the roof, which she claimed might collapse if it wasn't fixed immediately. Because I loved them, and because I was making a decent salary, I sent the money. Over those 3 years, I transferred exactly $18,700 to their account. I was a meticulous person, so I tracked every single transfer in a private folder, just in case. Every time I sent money, my mother would tell me, "We'll remember this, Rayell." At the time, I thought she meant she was grateful. I guess she just meant she was adding it to her own version of the ledger. Back at the Sunday dinner table, the silence was heavy enough to suffocate. I finished reading the invoice and set it down next to my untouched chicken. I looked my mother in the eye and asked one simple question. Why now? She didn't blink. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and spoke with a sharpness that cut through me. "Because you've always acted like we owed you something," she said. The room went even quieter, if that was possible. Then, she said the part that shifted the ground beneath my feet. "You were a difficult child, Rayell. You ruined my 20s. I gave up my best years to raise you, and I want that time back in the form of security." That was the moment I realized this wasn't actually about the $312,000. This wasn't a financial dispute. It was deep-seated, ugly resentment that had been simmering for decades. My mother didn't see a daughter. She saw a debt that could never truly be repaid. Resentment like that leaves fingerprints on everything it touches, and I finally saw them all over my childhood. That night, after I left their house without saying another word, I sat in my dark apartment and opened a digital folder I had kept for years. It was filled with the evidence of my ungratefulness. I scrolled through dozens of screenshots of bank transfer confirmations. I listened to old voicemails of my mother's voice sounding frantic, asking for temporary help, with bills that never seemed to end. I found a specific message from 2 years ago where she wrote, "Don't tell your father I asked for this money, he'd be embarrassed." But as I dug deeper into my old digital files and scanned documents from my late grandmother's estate, I found something I had overlooked before. It was an old email from my grandmother, sent shortly before she passed away. In the email, she mentioned a college fund she had worked hard to set aside for both grandchildren. She wanted us both to have a head start. I felt a pit form in my stomach. My brother had his college paid for, but I had never received a single dime from a fund. I had worked 2 jobs and took out loans that I was still paying back. The next morning, I didn't go to work immediately. Instead, I called the bank listed in my grandmother's old estate paperwork. Because I was listed as a secondary beneficiary on the original documents, I was able to get some basic information. My heart pounded as the teller pulled up the history. There had indeed been a 529 education account opened in my name, but the records showed it had been liquidated when I was 19 years old, right when I was starting my sophomore year of college and begging for help with my tuition. The entire balance had been transferred directly into my parents' joint checking account. The amount was $42,000. I sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel. I had spent years feeling guilty for being a financial burden, while my parents sat on $42,000 that was legally and morally mine. I had paid my own tuition with high-interest loans while my brother graduated completely debt-free. I thought that discovery would be the final twist in this nightmare. I was wrong. It was just the fuel I needed to build my own invoice. 2 days later, my mother decided to escalate our private conflict into a public spectacle. Without warning, she sent a photo of the invoice to our extended family group chat. The chat included my aunts, my cousins, and even several of her friends from church. Below the image of the $312,000 bill, she wrote a caption. "Some children forget what sacrifice looks like. It's a shame when you raise them to be successful and they turn their backs on the people who put them there." The notification pings on my phone were constant. I saw the scene icons pop up one by one. The public pressure was immediate and suffocating. A few cousins sent private messages asking if I was okay, but most of the family stayed silent, watching the drama unfold like a car crash. My mother thought she was shaming me into submission. She thought that by involving the church and the family, I would be forced to write her a check to save my reputation. But she made one massive mistake. She posted the total. Numbers invite comparison, and I was finally ready to show everyone my math. I didn't respond with a long, emotional paragraph. I didn't call her crying or scream into the phone. Instead, I spent the afternoon at my computer, using my professional skills to create a document of my own. I titled it, Statement of Accounts, Daughter to Parents. I kept it clean, cold, and easy to read. I listed the line items clearly. First, direct family support, 3 years, $18,700. Second, grandmother's education fund misallocated $42,000. Third, I calculated the estimated loan interest incurred due to fund liquidation, $9,860. The total outstanding balance from parent to daughter came to exactly $70,560. I attached the PDF to the group chat, along with the screenshots of the bank transfers and the old bank record from my grandmother's account. At the very bottom of the message, I wrote, "If we're itemizing childhood, Mother, Let's itemize everything. I'm ready to settle the balance whenever you are." The group chat, which had been buzzing with activity, went absolutely dead quiet. Then my Aunt Martha typed the question that broke the dam. "Wait, what education fund, Rayell?" My father called me privately that night. For the first time in my life, he sounded old and incredibly tired. He didn't yell. He admitted with a heavy sigh that the college fund had been used during a tight year for the family. I felt a flicker of sympathy until I remembered what that tight year actually looked like. That was the year they did a full kitchen remodel with granite countertops. That was the year they took a 2-week vacation to Napa Valley. That was the year my father drove home in a brand new SUV. "It was complicated, Rayell," he whispered over the phone. I told him the truth. "No, Dad, it was convenient. They had stolen my future to fund their lifestyle, and then they had the nerve to bill me for the sacrifice of raising me. I didn't threaten to sue them or cut them off forever right then. I just said, 'I won't be paying your invoice, and I expect you to think very carefully about how you're going to fix this.' I thought that would be enough to make my mother back down. I underestimated her pride. The following Sunday, my mother decided to double down on her narrative. I went to the morning service, mostly because I didn't want anyone to think I was hiding. After the service ended, she approached me in the lobby, right where 3 women from her Bible study group were standing. She didn't look like a woman who had been caught in a lie. She looked like a martyr. She said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Rayell, I'm praying for your heart. Family doesn't keep score like this." I looked at her, seeing the desperation behind her eyes. I didn't lower my voice. "You're right, Mom. Family doesn't. But you're the one who started the spreadsheet," I replied. The Bible study women went perfectly still. One of them, a woman named Mrs. Higgins, looked at my mother and asked quietly, "Did you really charge her for groceries, Linda?" My mother tried to laugh it off as if it were a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. I watched as the women's expressions shifted from sympathy to confusion and then to judgment. Reputations crack quietly before they shatter, and I could hear the ceramic of her social standing beginning to splinter. A week later, my brother called me. The smirk I had seen at the dinner table was completely gone from his voice. He had never known about the college fund either. He had grown up believing that our parents had simply been able to afford his tuition because they worked hard, while I was just less deserving of help. When he saw my counter-invoice and the documentation in the group chat, he finally confronted them. He learned that the SUV he thought was a gift for his graduation had actually been refinanced using the remainder of the education fund my grandmother left for me. He wasn't the favorite child anymore. He was just another pawn in their financial games. He sounded broken as he apologized for every time he'd looked down on me for struggling with my loans. That was the moment the alliances in our family officially shifted. He realized that the good daughter was actually the one who had been keeping the family afloat for the last 3 years, while the perfect son had been living on stolen money. He told me he was standing by me, no matter what our mother said. The real downfall began when my Aunt Martha, who was the actual executor of my grandmother's estate, decided to get involved. She didn't like the drama, but she loved the law. She requested a formal audit of the estate records. There was nothing dramatic about it, just a lot of boring paperwork and bank statements. But the paperwork told a story that couldn't be ignored. The illegal transfers from my trust to my parents' personal account were confirmed. My grandmother's will was crystal clear. Equal distribution for education. Word traveled through our extended family like electricity moving through dry air. There were no lawsuits and no police involved. It was just the cold reality of consequence. Aunt Martha informed my parents that they were legally required to reimburse the estate for the misallocated funds. To avoid a public legal battle that would destroy their remaining reputation, they complied. The estate then reimbursed me directly. I saw the notification on my phone one Tuesday afternoon. $42,000 deposited into my account. There was no interest added, but the silence that followed from my mother was louder than any interest could ever be. The reimbursement of the money didn't actually hurt my mother the most. What destroyed her was the loss of her reputation. In our small social circle, her perfect parent image was her most prized possession. Now, family gatherings were different. Conversations would hush to a whisper whenever she entered a room. People didn't look at her with admiration anymore. They looked at her with pity and caution. The church leadership even quietly rotated her out of the finance committee, citing a need for fresh perspectives. Trust erodes much faster than money ever does. My father eventually apologized to me in private, admitting he should have stood up to her years ago. My brother took me out to dinner one night and insisted on paying. He looked me in the eye and said, "I'm sorry I never saw it, Rayell. I'm sorry I let them make you the villain." For the first time in my 30 years of life, I wasn't the difficult child or the ungrateful daughter. I was simply the honest one. I used the reimbursement money to pay off the majority of my remaining student loans. It felt like a physical weight being lifted off my shoulders. I also started therapy to unpack the years of conditional love and manipulation. I stopped answering the late-night emergency calls from my mother. I set boundaries that were made of iron. On the 1-year anniversary of that infamous Sunday dinner, I mailed one final envelope to my parents' house. Inside was a single sheet of paper. There were no numbers on it. There was no anger or list of grievances. It contained just one sentence: "Children do not owe their parents for existing." I didn't block her number, and I didn't scream at her. I just simply stopped playing the role of the debtor in a game I never agreed to join. My mother still tries to send small jabs through the group chat occasionally, but they don't land anymore. The ledger is finally clear. That was the only invoice in my life that ever truly closed, and for the first time, I am finally free.